Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the specific human biology of coordination and control. We talked about nervous and endocrine systems in general across the animal kingdom a few weeks ago, but we're going to come back and zoom in on the human brain and human endocrine system. So many of you may be extremely interested in these topics. We're just going to scratch the surface on an introduction to them. All right, so we already talked about neurons. And so neurons are going to be the basic component of our nervous system, especially in the peripheral nervous system. But it turns out that we have many other types of cells that participate, especially in the brain, in order to protect and take care of the neurons. So we have a list of our different kinds of cells that are shown in this figure. So the cells that are not neurons in vertebrates are called glial cells, G-L-I-A. And there are several different kinds. So when we look at the vertebrate nervous system and how it's different than the nervous systems of invertebrates, one of the things that's important is the presence of these Schwann cells and oligodendrocyte cells. What they do in the vertebrate nervous system, which doesn't exist in invertebrates, is they create a structure known as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is made of these cells. So Schwann cells literally are cells that if you took them and rolled them out thin like a tortilla and then wrapped them around the axons of the nerve cells, that's basically what they are. It's really weird. And they serve as an insulator for the message that is going down the axon. So if we look at the axon and we see where these Schwann cells are wrapped around it, they basically create areas along the axon where there can't be any opening or closing of the ion channels. So we'll have a depolarization of the axon that happens in one location. And instead of triggering an action potential that occurs in the next little section of the axon, basically the ions are going to continue to diffuse until they get past that section that's covered by the Schwann cell. And it's going to postpone the next action potential until it gets to this next little gap or node. And the combination of diffusion, moving those sodium ions down to the next node, and then delaying, it actually ends up going faster. It actually ends up transmitting a message faster than if it had to wait for several separate action potentials happening in that section. So the myelin sheath's function is to increase the rate of transmission of nerve messages. In the peripheral nervous system, the myelin sheath is made up of Schwann cells, and in the central nervous system, the myelin sheath is made up of oligodendrocytes. So these oligodendrocytes you can see here, and if you haven't noticed at the top of this figure, it does make a distinction between the central nervous system structures to the left and the peripheral nervous system structures to the right. So other types of glial cells in the brain or the central nervous system include astrocytes. Astro means star. These cells are actually more like the entourage rather than the star. Notice that they're fastened to neurons, they're fastened to capillaries, and they actually do the work of transferring nutrients to and oxygen to the neurons. and they transfer waste products back into the capillary from the neurons. Their function is to create something that's called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier, I used to imagine that it was some kind of saran wrap-like thing, but it's not. It's actually dynamic and complicated in its actual physical structure. But the blood-brain barrier puts a separation in between the capillaries, representing the circulatory system of the blood, and the cells that make up the brain. The brain is very important, and we don't want any molecules getting into it that are toxic. We don't want any molecules getting into these cells that are going to harm those neurons. And so the existence of the astrocytes and the function that they do, basically screening molecules and then also taking care of all of the needs of the neurons, is one of the main components of this blood-brain barrier. So they protect and take care of the neurons. Another type of cell that does that are the microglial cells. The microglial cells in this slide are these little snowflake cells, and they're intermingled among all these other cells, and their function is as part of the immune system. So they're going to recognize and destroy pathogens, and they're also going to remove damaged neurons and help trigger their replacement. All right, so we used to think that there were no neurons that grew or regenerated inside the brain. We now know that although it's much, much slower and a smaller number compared to other parts of the body, that there are new neurons that are created and that some repairs can be made in the brain. All right, the other cells that are being shown are the ependymal cells. Now, the ependymal cells create a lining. So they're the epithelial cells. Notice they have little cilia on one side, and that they're connected to the capillary via astrocytes on the other side. They form the epithelium of the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles of the brain are fluid-filled spaces. Those fluid-filled spaces actually help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, all right, cerebrospinal fluid, fills up these spaces. If you remember back from when we talked about development in lab, development of vertebrates, the main part of the central nervous system is formed by this ridge growing on the surface of the embryo, fusing together at the top and creating that tube that makes up the primitive nervous system. So this cerebrospinal fluid fills that space, both in the brain and in the spinal cord, which is considered part of the central nervous system. So the ependymals not only have a function of helping to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid with the little cilia that are lining them, they have tight junctions in between them, which means that the cells are fused together very closely. So they also help create the blood-brain barrier, noticing also that the astrocytes are forming an intermediary between them and the capillaries. And so the ependymals also help create and manage that cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so there's lots going on in the brain besides the actual neurons. And part of the difference the human brain has besides other vertebrate brains is in the types and functions of some of these glial cells. So there have been experiments where some human glial cells have actually been transplanted into, say, mice, and the mice get smarter. Right, so when we look at the human nervous system, the brain and spinal cord form what is considered the central nervous system, responsible for processing and integrating information, sending instructions back to the various parts of the body. The peripheral nerves, including the ganglia, those mini brains that are outside the central nervous system. And there's a ganglion at each of these spinal nerves and cranial nerves where it branches out from the spinal cord. So all of those nerves are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. We look at the brain itself and also the spinal cord. We see that it's made up of two types of material. The gray matter is neurons that the axons are not coated with myelin sheath, and the white matter is formed with axons that are coated with myelin sheath. The formation of the myelin sheath continues for some time after the birth of a baby. And so some of the clumsiness that tiny babies and small toddlers have is because their nervous system is sort of continuing to be formed, this early development, even after they're born, some of the work in progress that still needs to be finished. So if we take a frontal section through the brain, we also see these openings or spaces, the ventricles. And when we look at it from the side, we can see that they take up a moderate amount of space and do extend down into the central nervous system. What we're seeing on the outside of the brain is this ridged surface, and that is actually the cerebrum. The cerebrum is this outer layer of highly folded material or structure of the brain, sort of covers over most of other parts of our brain. When we look at how human brains are different than other animal brains, invertebrates, they have the basic same brain parts, but as we go from reptiles to mammals to primates to humans, we see that the size, extent, complexity of the folding of the cerebrum is greatly enhanced in primates and especially in humans. So the overall size of the brain relative to the body is much larger as well. The brain itself is made up of neurons, and it's actually billions of neurons. All right, so we're going to look at the parts of the brain. And when we look at those early embryos of whether it's chicken or any other vertebrate, we're going to see that the primitive brain is going to be made up of these three parts: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So three parts. We're not going to worry about what they sort of start to develop into early in the embryo, but we want to look at what these different parts of the embryonic brain turn into in the adult brain. So the forebrain turns into two of the major parts of the adult brain, the cerebrum and the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made of two major parts, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The midbrain turns into the midbrain. The midbrain is part of the brain stem. So the brain stem consists of the rest of the hindbrain. And the hindbrain turns into the pons and the cerebellum. It also turns into a structure called the medulla oblongata, which is part of the brain stem. So the brain stem, the base of the brain, has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, whereas the cerebellum is not considered part of the brain stem. However, it does arise from the embryonic hindbrain. So we will briefly look at the functions of these different parts of the brain. We'll look in a little more detail at the rest of the functions of the cerebrum in the next slide. So we'll start by saying that the cerebrum is responsible for the things that we consider conscious thought, voluntary movement, perception, learning, and memory. And we'll come back to those functions in a few minutes. One of the important parts of the cerebrum is the forebrain, and sometimes it's referred to as the prefrontal cortex. And it's super duper important in our everyday lives because it is responsible for helping us make good choices to interact appropriately with others and our personality and management of our emotions. So when we talk about somebody being intelligent, we might say they're a deep thinker or that they're really cerebral, right? So we do have this word cerebrum that refers to the sort of the top and front part of our brain, which is responsible for those fun thinking and decision making. And then we have this part of the brain that's in the back, right, called the cerebellum. Don't get the cerebrum and the cerebellum mixed up. So somebody who's a really good athlete, the reason they can do those really spectacular and special physical movements of their bodies, or if they're an extremely practiced musician, those movements have become almost instinctual. And when we do a movement and we're trying to learn something in the first place, we are managing that activity. We have to think about, oh my gosh, I have to shift my foot this way, and I have to keep my eye on the ball, and I have to keep my elbows in, and I have to do all those things, right? It's impossible to do that movement, whether it's swinging a baseball bat or playing a rapid scale on the piano. It's impossible to do those things if we have to think about every step that we need to take and tell our body parts to do it. Once we've done it many, many, many times, the cerebellum takes over on that task, right? So it moves from a part of our brain that we have to sort of consciously manage and control, which is not the best way to do it, to almost having those movements become second nature. We don't think about them anymore. I learned to type on a typewriter many years ago, and you go through practice sentences, practice, when you just by rote, you just do them over and over and over again. Eventually you get to the point where, which I experience now, when I'm typing, I'm not thinking I have to move this finger to this key, but I'm actually typing faster than I could actually have a thought that I'm typing that word, right? So you're able to physically do things faster and more accurately when you're not thinking about them. All right, so athletes may say they're in the flow, or they're really in the moment, or the time slows down for them, but all of those things are a result of many, many, many repetitions so that it becomes automatic. All right, so looking at other parts of the brain, the diencephalon has the two components of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a place in the brain that regulates most of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. We'll come back to the pituitary gland when we talk about hormones, but it is a regulator gland, and it regulates the activities of other glands. And many of those glands participate in homeostasis. So when we say that the hypothalamus is responsible for managing homeostasis, it actually sends messages to the pituitary, and then the pituitary sends messages to other parts of the endocrine system. The thalamus has a special location. Notice that it's right on top of the brainstem. It's kind of like the switchboard. It takes information coming from the senses, coming from the body, the motor system, sensory organs, and it passes them to the appropriate places in the cerebrum. So it's also responsible for regulating sort of our consciousness, awareness, sleep, and waking cycles, or called arousal. So not sexual arousal, but being awake and being conscious. So it's going to regulate that activity in our cerebrum based on information coming from the rest of the body. So the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla have similar functions, which are to transmit information from the peripheral nervous system to the brain. They control autonomic nervous system functions, right? So autonomic is another word for automatic, things that we don't think about, or when we're not thinking about them, they go on without us. For example, breathing, the heartbeat, functions of digestion. So these are basic body functions that even if we didn't have a cerebrum, that the brain would need to be able to manage. Now we can consciously decide to breathe more slowly if we're meditating or something like that. But in the absence of our conscious control overriding these mechanisms, they will be managed automatically by your brain stem. This portion of the brain is also called the reptile brain. Reptiles don't have a great big cerebrum, but they still manage to do all of the activities of daily living, right? And those are managed, even behaviors are managed by the combination of the brain stem and the cerebellum. The brain stem is also responsible for controlling large-scale body movements. We can also think of this as being responsible for motor control. Remember that messages are coming from the brain, and they can have a response that's a motor response that's based on triggering different muscles to contract. So when we're doing walking, when we're doing breathing, those are things that require a coordinated set of muscular movements, but not a very fine control of those movements. We're not playing the piano, we're just walking. We're not catching or throwing a baseball, we're just walking, right? And think about that lizard. Think about what the lizard does during its, day-to-day existence. It can catch food, it can run around, it can find mates. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be able to do using the brain stem only. All right, I briefly talked about the cerebellum already. So we can think of it coordinating movement at balance at a finer scale of detail. For example, how we think about eye-hand coordination or muscle memory, right? So that once we have repeatedly done a particular task that's at a higher level of function than the cerebellum takes over doing. Right, so if we look at the functions of the cerebral cortex in a little more detail, we're going to see that we can differentiate different parts of this. So this is just sort of an outer surface layer on the rest of those brain parts, starting from the front. The frontal lobe is going to be sort of like the overseer of all of this information. So decision-making and complex problem solving occurs in the frontal lobe. The olfactory lobe is also part of this section of the brain. So smell, interpreting smell information or olfaction, and the things that we think of as cognition, thinking, attention, speech, decision-making, social functions, and risk-taking are regulated by the frontal lobe. The motor cortex is in the sort of little back section of that frontal lobe, and it sends messages to muscles and glands. It's responsible for voluntary movement or coordination. There's this section in the brain that separates the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex. The somatosensory cortex is a part of the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe is responsible for receiving sensory information from sensoreceptors, and it's also responsible for spatial orientation. Somatosensory responses are things like touch, and orientation responses involve that little balance organ we have in our inner ear. They're sometimes also called proprioception, where we're able to determine our orientation relative to other things. Speech and reading are also managed by the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, which is on the side of the brain, is involved in sound, and there's a little portion of this section of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for processing and managing memories. The temporal lobe is also involved in interpretation of language, because it is involved in processing sound. Right. The occipital lobe receives and processes visual information. Remember, what our brain is doing is perception. It's making sense out of the information that we see. So neurons get activated in our sense receptors, but that information is just an on-off switch. It just says, this sense was received. Your brain actually has to interpret that information. And so what does it mean? What is that thing? Put a word to it, put a description to it. Is it a threat? Is it something I should go towards or away from? All right, so all of this is there's much more complicated interpretation of these different parts of the brain. This is just a very, very simple overview. All right, shifting our attention to the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system has two parts. The part that is sending information towards the brain. Remember, each nerve has one-way traffic. The afferent neurons, such as hearing, not just hearing, but all of our senses sense information, is going to be passing that information towards the central nervous system. And the efferent neurons are going to be taking information away from the central nervous system. So I remember this because in Spanish, is towards and de is away from. So what are they towards and away from? The brain, right? So each nerve is going to have a one-way job. Now, efferent neurons have two different kinds, ones that are going to go to the motor system. So in this case, we have a nerve that connects directly from the spinal cord to a particular muscle bundle. And it's going to regulate the contraction of that muscle bundle. The other section, or the other set of nerves, are not going to go to the skeletal, the skeletal muscle. They're going to go to basically everything else there is in the body that the nervous system regulates and controls. So we can separate that into three different groups of nerves. So imagine that you are wiring a robot, and you're going to have a set of wires that are going to go to its legs or whatever, and you want to tell them to do a particular set of activities, walk forwards. Right? Imagine that you needed to have a completely separate set of wires that were going to those same places, but that they gave the instruction to walk backwards. Right? That you couldn't just send the same message to the same parts, a different message to the same parts. That is how a lot of our overall body responses are managed. Right? We have sort of two whole different sets of nerves that go to the same set of body parts, and it gives them one of two different instructions. Fight or flight, which I've recently learned we can also call fight, flight, or freeze. If you're one of those people that just can't do anything when you're in a stressed out situation, there's a state for you. And then the rest and digest set of body responses. So we were either in this activated state or in a resting state. The activated state is triggered by a set of nerves called the sympathetic division. So you can remember that sympathetic is not nice or friendly, it's snake. You see a snake, the sympathetic division of the nervous system is activated. We also talked about how we have perhaps a hormone like epinephrine that's released, and it turns on a whole set of responses that are coordinated to have us do what we need to for that response, right? We increase blood flow to the places that need it. We increase the heart rate, we increase the respiration rate. We divert blood flow to the brain. We release glucose into the circulating bloodstream to power all of that thinking and movement that we may need to do in order to respond to this threat. The parasympathetic division, on the other hand, when we stop triggering the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic division is a series of responses that downregulates, suppresses, or inhibits those stress responses. So it's going to send the message to return all of those functions to normal, decrease the heart rate, to decrease the breathing rate, to balance, put us back into homeostasis, basically. The third group of nerves is connected to this whole long series of body organs that are responsible for digestion and absorption. So it's called the enteric division. And that is actually not just the small and large intestine that are shown in this diagram, but everything from the mouth all the way to the anus. So in order for us to get the best amount of nutrients absorbed from our food, we have a coordinated set of responses that are happening all the way down the digestive tract. We need to have saliva start to be released when we start put food in our mouth, or we start chewing, or even when we start smelling food. We're going to have need to feel hungry when it's about that time of day that we should be eating again, when our blood glucose levels are dropping, right? So the set of nerves that are going to be connected to every part of this digestive system are going to manage that incredibly important process, because we do not have enough energy. We do not have all the nutrients we need to run our body if those processes aren't working right. So the other thing about the autonomic nervous system that I forgot to mention is that it's automatic. These are things that are going to be done by the body, whether you are thinking about them or not. You don't have to think about, squishing food from your stomach into your small intestine. Your body does that for you. All right, so autonomic or automatic parts of our nervous system. All right, let me just see if I have any other notes about the nervous system before we move on to the endocrine system. All right, so as we look at evolutionary changes between different groups of mammals, including primates, my last word on the brain is that we see, depending on the environment of the organism, emphasis on different parts of the brain. So we might see organisms that rely heavily on a sense of smell. We'll see an actual larger portion of the brain devoted to the olfactory lobe, where we have an organism that requires a lot of input and processing from its visual sense information. We'll see a larger proportion of the brain. So looking across the world of vertebrates, we do see some variety in the evolutionary changes that have happened on the sort of basic version of the vertebrate brain. All right, our second topic for today is the endocrine system. So overall, our body is managed and regulated by this coordination between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a set of glands that are primarily, their job is to secrete hormones. So we call those glands. Typically, it's a small body organ that secretes something. And then we also have a lot of other body organs that also kind of, not necessarily as their most important job, but they may also secrete hormones. All right, so there's going to be some of those secretory cells in, say, for example, the heart. So even their primary job of the heart is to contract and pump blood through the body. It also has other side jobs, part-time jobs. All right. So what we find in the brain sort of rolled up around the brain, are two important regulatory glands. So when we have these tropic hormones that are controlled by other hormones, a lot of where the originator of those tropic cascades are in the hypothalamus and in the pituitary gland. So they're very closely associated with parts of the brain that are getting nerve messages from sense organs and receptors. So there's dozens of receptors that are different locations around the body that let the brain know what's going on. So whether those are osmoreceptors or whether they're oxygen receptors, they can tell the brain that something is out of homeostasis. All right, so the hypothalamus is going to mainly be regulating other glands, and it specifically has a very close connection to the pituitary gland. Right? The pituitary gland has two parts, the anterior and the posterior, and they basically function like completely different glands. So the pineal gland, it's actually deeply buried in the middle of the brain, but in early vertebrates, it's right on the top of the head. And it is in fact not just right on the top of the head, but underneath a little window in the skull that lets light shine on it. So the pineal gland historically in vertebrate evolution was responsible for detecting night versus day or light versus dark, and releases a hormone called melatonin. I have all the hormones on the next slide, so we'll be jumping back and forth between these two slides. So melatonin regulates the sleep and waking cycle. So when it goes through your body, it slows the breathing rate, it slows the heart rate, and those kinds of changes in your body that put you to sleep. Now, even though it has become buried into the middle of the brain, it receives information from the optic nerve, from the eye, about light versus dark. Right, so melatonin, this is a hormone that is going to regulate sleep and waking. All right, the next gland I have is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located basically kind of laying on top of your trachea. Embedded in the thyroid but functioning separately are the parathyroid glands. Thyroid gland is a master gland that regulates metabolic rate. So it's going to either increase your metabolic rate or decrease your metabolic rate depending on the needs of the body. So when we think about whether the body is obtaining and using the appropriate amount of energy on a daily basis, basically whether we're gaining weight or losing weight, the thyroid gland is responsible for those kinds of decisions. So people with too little thyroid hormone, hypothyroid condition, will be lethargic and tend to gain weight. People with an overactive thyroid or hyperthyroid condition will tend to be very thin and kind of manic. So the thyroid gland is also responsible for releasing calcitonin, which is going to be responsible for bone mineralization. Right. So the hormones thyroxine, also called T3 and T4, what they're going to regulate is overall metabolic rate. And calcitonin is going to increase calcium in bone. Right? So it's really important when children are growing and their skeletons are getting built. It's important in pregnancy in order to make sure that the mom remineralizes any losses to her bone mass from supporting the fetus during pregnancy. And it kind of acts as the opposite to parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone kicks in when we don't have enough calcium. We have too much calcium, we're going to use it, we're going to remineralize the bones with it. Our next gland is returning to the pituitary in the brain, and it has two parts. The anterior pituitary secretes human growth hormone, which regulates growth. It also secretes thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone. It's going to regulate the thyroid. And we also have adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is also a tropic hormone, which regulates the adrenal glands. We'll see what the adrenal glands do in a few minutes. All right, so human growth hormone not only regulates growth, so obviously when children are growing and building their body in the first place, a lot of this hormone is being released. But if you think about it as determining the rates of, say, mitosis happening in the body, we not only use mitosis for growth, but also for repair, right? So where you have damage to cells, where you have been straining the body, putting it under stress, whether that's due to an injury or whether it's due to physical training, you're going to recover and rebuild and heal from that damage faster when you have higher levels of human growth hormone. As secretion of this hormone declines with age, older folks are going to have a harder time repairing or recovering from injury and illness than younger people do, right? HGH is also used as an illegal performance enhancing drug because it does improve the rapidity of recovery. It does help you do things like build muscle mass as a result of training faster. Right, so we also talked about anterior pituitary hormones. So human growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone is going to regulate the thyroid. Right. And then adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to regulate the adrenal glands. So pituitary is also a master gland. We think about it because it helps regulate other glands. Pituitary also has jobs to do in managing reproduction and development. We'll set those aside for now. All right, the posterior pituitary releases one of my favorite hormones called oxytocin, and it also releases antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Antidiuretic hormone, we'll talk about it more when we come back to the kidney and the function of the kidney, but a diuretic is something that makes you pee a lot, right? So antidiuretic hormone is going to cause you to retain water in the body. So if you're dehydrated, antidiuretic hormone will be secreted, all right? So it's going to regulate water. Regulate the total amount of water in the body. So coming back to oxytocin, oxytocin has many functions. It is associated with childbirth, with breastfeeding, and it is also released in the brain after sexual orgasm. It is released in the brain when engaging in non-sexual social activities. It's a mammalian hormone. For mammals, moms need to care about their offspring, and the presence of oxytocin in the circulatory system is responsible for feelings of affiliation or caring or even love, right? So that feeling of sort of contentment, well-being, and wanting to help others is in part a result of the release of oxytocin. So it is going to, doesn't exactly regulate anything in the body, but it is responsible for emotional attachment between individuals. And here's a crazy thing about how hormones work. They're released in our brains, or they're released by these body organs based on habituation. So when we have a person that we usually have good feelings when we're around them, or we have a pet or a place that we really love, and we have repeated contact with that individual, our brains learn to release oxytocin into our circulating bloodstream, even when we're just looking at a picture of that person, right? So love is a habit, and other mammals have it. It doesn't do exactly the same things in their brain, but it does exist. So you love your dog loves you back. Oxytocin is being released in their brain as well. So it has a lot of other complicated functions, and that works in concert with other neurotransmitters, but it can also help us manage stress in the body. So it is a wonderful hormone that it's fun to learn more about. All right. We've already talked about the parathyroid hormone. Its job is going to be to regulate calcium, and it's going to be released in order to increase calcium in the blood. We're going to move to the adrenal glands next. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys like little fat hats, and they release a variety of hormones. So one of them, previously known as adrenaline, is known as epinephrine. And epinephrine is responsible for triggering the sympathetic nervous response. So when epinephrine is released, where do I have my notes for that? It's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And it works over a very short time frame. It is released into your bloodstream and it disappears again. It's a small protein. It's broken down by your kidney, removed from their circulating bloodstream by your kidneys in about a minute, right? So you have that sudden burst of whatever you want to call it, fear, activation, and it retreats. The other hormone that's released, well, there's other hormones, so I'm giving you a short list. Another hormone that's released by the adrenal glands under the same stimulus is cortisol. Cortisol, on the other hand, is a steroid hormone. It has a much longer residence time in the circulating bloodstream. So even though that super fast heart rate slows down a little bit, you still feel a little on edge for a while after that stressful event has happened. All right, so cortisol is going to also be involved in stress-related changes in your body. It is going to participate in activating the sympathetic nervous system. It causes a variety of changes in the physiology that we think about as being what happens to our bodies when we're under stress. But it is going to have a longer residence time. So it's going to last about an hour. And one thing that we do when we're measuring somebody's stress level is measure the amount of circulating cortisol in their bloodstream. If they are under kind of a constant level of stress, we'll see elevated levels of cortisol. So those stress-related physiological changes that can lead long-term to damage to the cardiovascular system and other kinds of negative health outcomes, those are a result of hormones like cortisol that stay in the bloodstream for longer periods of time. All right, so de-stressing, being able to de-stress, have periods of time during the day when, as hard as it may be, that you let your body rest and come to a sort of a full screeching halt, that you're totally back into the parasympathetic mode, is an important task for your long-term health. Whether it's a few minutes because you're able to do some deep breathing exercises and meditate, or you're totally able to relax into reading a book or playing a game, watching a movie, listening to music, something that really feels soothing to you physiologically. Your body needs a break from the cortisol. So those things are important to roll into our everyday activities. All right, we already talked in class about the pancreas and the molecules, the hormones it releases, insulin and glucagon. Right? So these are both responsible for regulating blood glucose. They're both released by the pancreas. All right, making our way through our figure here, we've talked about the pancreas. Kidney, we're going to come back to it when we talk about water balance, but there is a hormone that I want to mention with the kidney, and that is erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that manages the number of red blood cells circulating in your bloodstream. Red blood cells, or erythrocytes, we need to have enough of them so that oxygen transport is being accomplished. But we don't want so many of them that our blood gets too viscous or thick. Now, red blood cells are naturally disintegrated or broken down in the spleen. They have a lifespan of a certain amount of time, a couple months. They don't have a nucleus of their own. They can't divide. So we definitely have to make new red blood cells from the bone marrow. So as they are decreasing over time, the kidneys are the location where the detection of the decreased oxygen concentration in the blood happens. And this hormone erythropoietin is going to trigger the bone marrow to release new red blood cells to regenerate the number that you need. So this also happens, say you donate blood, right? So you have an injury where you lose a lot of blood. You need a bunch of water in that case as well, but you're just going to make some more red blood cells to make up for the loss. Angiotensin is our next hormone on this list, and it is secreted by the liver, right? So angiotensin is also going to be involved in regulating body water. And we'll come back to it when we talk more about the kidneys. Our next two hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are released by the gonads. In males, the testes; in females, the ovaries. And we are going to, there's a wide variety of other reproductive hormones. The primary functions of estrogen and testosterone are to produce, during development, and maintain secondary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics are those things that when we look at human males and we look at human females, we see that are different. So whether the voice is high or low, the relative size and shape of certain facial features, the development of breasts, the development of body hair in different places, the amount of muscle development. So for example, if a person who is biologically female with X chromosomes, if they take injections of testosterone, their voice will become deeper, they'll start having facial hair grow, and the amount of muscle mass that they will be able to add doing exercise will increase a great deal. So when we're talking about the trans community, actual exposures or ongoing treatments with these different sex hormones do actually cause there to be ongoing changes in the body that make it look like the opposite sex. And the brain also has messages that it gets from testosterone and from estrogen. Now, women have naturally a small amount of circulating testosterone. Men have small amounts of circulating estrogen as well. So these are not unique to one sex or the other, but in a testosterone dominant brain versus an estrogen dominant brain, the kinds of other effects have to do with a wide variety of personality traits and cognitive functions. Estrogen seems to make people with high estrogen levels in their bodies more facile, that is, using more easily words. Somehow in the brain, it fastens to parts of neurons that make us understand and use words more easily. That's why women talk faster and use more words. Also, estrogen is a hormone. If it's dominant in your brain, different things may be important to you than if you have a testosterone dominant brain. Estrogen dominant brains value communication and collaboration. Testosterone dominant brains value competition and hierarchy. Emotions are regulated differently under the control of estrogen versus testosterone. Testosterone dominant brains feel and are triggered to express anger more often and more intensely than estrogen dominant brains. Sex drive is higher in testosterone dominant brains. Self-esteem is higher in testosterone dominant brains. And testosterone also protects against the sensation of pain. All right, so there's a wide variety of things that occur in our bodies, in our moods, in our daily lives that are actually a result of the so-called sex hormones. Fascinating area. All right, what's next? Testosterone, estrogen. I'm just going to write here sex. I'm trying to write sex characteristics, but my pen is not working at the moment. We have the heart, and we have the stomach, the intestine, and fat tissue left. All right. The heart, like I said before, it also, besides beating, its most important job, releases a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. And what ANP does is it is released when there's too high of a blood volume. All right, so if you're retaining water, you don't have enough salts, then your body may become has too much water in it. And so it is going to cause an increase in the water going into the urine. All right, so it also is going to help regulate body water. My pen is not writing right now. So this ANP is released by the heart. So why the heart? Well, the heart is going to, the beating rate of the heart and the blood volume are going to determine the amount of blood that's actually being circulated. So the way that that this blood volume is regulated is actually by this release of this hormone. All right, so ANP, it is involved in regulating body water, and specifically it's released if the blood volume is too high, which is also going to trigger high blood pressure. All right, so it's a very important hormone. Our last couple of body organs include the stomach and the small intestine. All right, gastrin is a hormone that is released in the stomach, and it is going to stimulate the secretion of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, right? So when food comes into your stomach, it's going to increase the pH, make it less acidic. Your stomach needs to be acidic to digest foods. All right, so gastrin is a hormone that's released by the cells of the stomach itself in order to trigger other different cells of the stomach to secrete hydrochloric acid to acidify, lower the pH of the gut content, of the stomach contents, right? So regulating secretion of materials that are important in digestion. Now that acidic contents that's coming out of the stomach into the small intestine is going to not harm the stomach, but it will harm the small intestine. So secretin is a hormone that's released by the small intestine, which triggers the release of a buffering substance, sodium bicarbonate, into the small intestine by the pancreas, right? So secretin is a hormone that's released in order to rebalance the pH of the small intestine. And we had it as an example in our of a basic hormone negative feedback loop earlier in the semester. All right, so this is going to be regulating. So gastrin regulates pH of the stomach. Secretin regulates pH of the small intestine. And leptin is a fascinating hormone that a lot of research is being done on now. And the reason for that is it's involved in our appetite regulation, right? So there's two hormones actually that are involved in appetite regulation. We feel hungry, we feel the urge to eat. When do we want to do that? When we're low on energy, right? And then when we're higher on energy, we want to have a hormone that's going to suppress our appetite. Right, so leptin is a hormone that's actually released by our fatty tissue or adipose tissue, stored energy reserves, right? If our stored energy reserves are full up, they're going to be secreting leptin, which decreases appetite, and it's triggered by a sense of satisfaction of having eaten and having foods like proteins, complex carbohydrates, and healthy fats. The opposite hormone to leptin is actually released in the stomach, and it's not on this slide. It's called ghrelin. So I remember that when my stomach is growling, it's because ghrelin has been released. And what it does is it causes a sensation of hunger, which I am actually feeling right now because it's my lunchtime. All right, so our appetite is actually regulated whether we are feeling that urge to eat or not, based on a complex set of variables. So gaining or losing weight is actually an extremely hard thing to do because our body has habits. Our body has a set amount or a current amount, say, of stored fat in the body. And changing that amount is going to involve changing these patterns and routines that our body has gotten used to. So a few things that do help if you're trying to lose weight. What you eat, the composition of your food that you're eating helps. It helps to have more protein. It helps to have complex carbohydrates rather than simple carbohydrates. Don't drink sugary beverages. Eat regularly and have small meals. So 4 meals a day spread out is going to help manage those feelings of hunger as well. Drink lots of water. And getting exercise helps as well. Not only increases your metabolic rate, builds muscle mass. Muscle mass burns more calories at rest than fatty tissue does, but it's a long road. It takes persistence. It takes managing your stress so that you can not have additional stressors on top of these changes that you need to make in your lifestyle. And it's time consuming. You have to rethink patterns, make changes in your daily habits, which is hard to do. All right, so all of these, this is not nearly all of the hormones in the human body. This is an introduction. And we're just going to go back to looking at these organs containing endocrine cells. We talked about the heart, the liver, the stomach, kidney, and the small intestine. And so even though we have this set of body organs called the endocrine system, which are glands, which main job is secreting hormones, we have all kinds of other locations in the body where hormones are also secreted. And overall body homeostasis is maintained by this coordination and cooperation between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And there's still so much more to learn about it. I hope you are even more excited about learning about human biology than you were at the beginning of this lecture.